Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today we're talking about
lessons we learned from Stoicon 2021. And you might say, well, what's that? Stoicon, I haven't heard of that. If you're one of our listeners, you might have, but there's a good chance that you haven't. So I think something that we have to start with is answering the question, what's Stoicon and why should we be interested in it? And, if you go to other cons or you go to other big gatherings like that, I think it's pretty easy to relate to. It's a conference or a convention, sort of like going to Comic-Con or Midwest Gaming Classic or the big auto show or stuff like that. And it's for people that are interested in Stoicism, and we're going to tell you more about that in just a bit. Anything else that you think we ought to add right off the bat, Dan?
Well, part of this is we were participants. We were definitely there to see all the things, but specifically, Greg and Andy were the hosts of this last year's Stoicon. And so not only is this a kind of like a retrospective of some of the topics that went on, but also of the whole process of like what it goes into to make an international conference on, a philosophy topic.
Yeah. So you've gone to other cons, right? Do you think it's different when it's philosophy oriented than when it's something that probably has a wider footprint? If you think about Comic-Con, for example, so Stoicon is like a pebble compared to the boulder that Comic-Con would be. So is it because it's not really just an academic thing. There's a lot of popular speakers there, but
there's definitely not like a merch alley that you see in a lot of of the more popular cons. There's each con has certain similarities, and they all have their own little lanes that they produce. And it was definitely not like a conference that I've gone that's really purely academic, especially in the computing space. I've been to a couple of really academic computing places, and those are it's still a whole bunch of nerds, but it's still pretty stuffy.
Yeah. I've gone to plenty of philosophy and political science, and even back when I was an undergraduate, a mathematics conference, where interestingly enough, the NSA was recruiting. Believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah. This is back in the early 90s, and they were viewed as the dark side within the mathematics community because they were very interested in cryptography. So they would recruit people, and my professor said, "You better watch out for those people." And I thought he was joking around, but sure enough, they were there all dressed up, going around and introducing themselves to people. Well, back to Stoicon, right? So we should.
Yeah.
Well, what is Stoicism? It's an ancient philosophy. I think anybody who's a regular listener to the show has heard me and Dan talk about it quite a bit. It's taught and discussed by authors all over the ancient world, from the Roman Empire to the Near East, and some of the big names that you might have heard of, or at least encountered before. Cicero, who's not quite a Stoic but really likes it. Seneca, who's definitely a Stoic. Epictetus, who actually taught Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius, who applied it in his imperial work, I guess you could say, among a whole bunch of others. And Dan and I are both members and co-organizers of the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship, so you can tell we have a considerable interest in it. What else do we need to say about it?
That it's been going on for Stoicism has been around for 400 years going on here. That it has gone through ebbs and flows throughout the history. It was very big from 300 BC to maybe 600 AD. Then it goes away. It comes back with the the
Renaissance, yeah.
Yeah. And then it went away again, and now in the last, 60, 80 years, it's gained a new renaissance itself.
Yeah. I mean, the last 20 years have been a huge boom, and I think a lot of that's attributable to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So, we don't actually have any clear numbers. We can say pretty confidently that there's at least hundreds of thousands of people in the present who are interested in and practicing and applying Stoicism, but there might be millions. And we don't even have a handle, quite frankly, on how many groups or organizations online or in person are doing it. I'm always finding out about new ones. And I'm the editor of Stoicism Today, so presumably I would, have some insight into this, but I'm always being surprised by there's Stoics in Indonesia doing this, or there's a new group in Germany, or pick whatever you want with that. So
yeah, and there's a database, the Stoic Fellowship, or the stoicfellowship.com. Stoicfellowship.com. No, that you can at least find some that might be around you. But yeah, with the advent of the internet, and especially things like Meetup that have allowed the facilitation of finding these little communities, it's really blown up.
Yeah, and we should mention too, before we go on further, that there are some big Facebook Stoicism groups, and Reddit has its own subreddit for Stoicism, but that's not the only place on Reddit where you can find people talking about Stoic philosophy. I know there were some other forums as well. LinkedIn has a few. I think Yahoo groups had a big Stoic forum that I've never participated in, but I think there's tens of thousands of people in that forum. So that gives you an idea about how interested people are in this. And so, there's Stoicon, and in the last 10 years, it's become a place where you could go and meet other people interested in Stoicism and hear talks by some of the, people who write the important books or who do a lot of other, let's call it Stoic programming, and you could participate in workshops. And when it was face-to-face, you could even buy books and some swag. There was no, as Dan was pointing out, what did you call it? Swag aisle? Swag?
Merch alley.
Merch alley, yeah. There wasn't anything quite like that. It's not like going to the Wisconsin Center and going in that gigantic room, which is just filled with booths. It would just be a couple booths with a couple people sitting there. But, it's still got some of that feel to it. And I know for myself, having gone to 3 of the Stoicons, one of the things I really liked about it was getting to interact with people outside of the sessions.
Yeah. From my experience, and those with the Stoicons that I've actually gone to, I guess only the Midwest one, but also in other ones, specifically when I went to Oculus Connect, being out there in the hallway and just meeting these people and having those one-on-one conversations were sometimes much more engaging than going to the talks themselves, especially because a lot of the times the talks are put up online afterwards.
True, yeah. At philosophy conferences, that's not often the case, unfortunately. Stoicon, it generally is now. They've gotten savvy to that. It's interesting. Would you say that when you go to a convention, a good part of what you're looking for is not just the stuff that's the official programming?
It depends on the conference.
Okay.
It depends on the Stoicon, kind of the main programming seems to be more interesting. And
than the random interactions that you have, yeah.
But where something's a little bit more fandom, there's lots of things that the participants in the con are also doing ancillary. So if you got a place where costuming is really big, then going out and seeing everyone's cosplay is a really big thing. And once again, the merch alley is another thing that is a large draw. And at developer conferences, for example, Oculus Connect, a lot of the developers would bring out their their demos, and they couldn't quite get onto one of the stages, but they're like, here's my newest work,
cool.
and so you get to see all these things that are still in production that people are working with and tinkering with.
Yeah, it's like an inside look, right?
Right.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. So going back to Stoicon, there's a history there, and we're going to run through it like super quick so we can get to some of the lessons that we learned. The very first conference that was put on, which wasn't quite Stoicon, was at the University of Exeter in Great Britain, and that was in 2012. And that was kind of, it was thrown together. It was a bunch of psychotherapists and academics and a few other people, and I think there were maybe 70 people attending it. And they thought, oh, this is great. There's so much interesting stuff going on here. And that's when they put together the first Live as a Stoic week, which now has become like an annual course. The very first official Stoicon was in 2013 in London. And there are some videos available on there's a Modern Stoicism YouTube channel, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And it was the same core group, and that would eventually become the Stoicism Today, and then later it became called Modern Stoicism Organization. And it really took off. It got a lot of press. People were like, what's this all about? Who's interested in Stoicism? And so they did it there in London for 3 years. And then I myself got involved when it moved to New York City in 2016. So it finally made it to a different place. That was Massimo Pigliucci organizing it, assisted by Amy Valadares, who actually helped out with all of the Stoicons until it went online. And then it was in Toronto in 2017. Donald Robertson organized that one, moved back to London in 2018. John Sellers organized that one. And then Donald Robertson took it to Athens in Greece. And I didn't make it to that one because I sure didn't want to try to fly to Athens in October myself. But, it looked like it was a pretty cool thing. I got to go to New York City and Toronto and London and present workshops. And then in 2020, it was supposed to be, I think it was supposed to be in Toronto again, but COVID hit. Right. So then we had, well, what are we going to do? And it turned into an online conference. And it drew in the big Stoicons drew in at most 400 people, which is, pretty sizable for this sort of event. The online Stoicon, the first one, drew in 1,400 people. And that's about what we had this year as well. So, clearly you can serve a lot more people going online. And, as Dan mentioned, Donald Robertson was originally going to run this year's one, but needed to step away. It turns out part of that is he's built an academy in Athens that you can read about online. So they asked, well, who's going to organize it? And I talked with my wife Andy, and I said, should we do this? And she said, yeah, we can do that. So we volunteered, and we had some assistance from Phil Yanoff, our tech person, and from Harold Kavli, my co-editor at Stoicism Today, who organized the lightning talks. But it was pretty much us, me and Andy, doing as much of it as we could. And we had some goals, and one of the goals was to make it as affordable as possible and to make it more engaging. Online conferences, I don't know, you should weigh in on this, Dan, because I know you do a lot of online events. Sometimes it's kind of tough to make them really engaging for the audience, so we wanted to try to do that. And then we also wanted to make it as accessible to people all over the world as possible. Time zone issues make it tough for people in some places, particularly East Asia and Australia and Indonesia. But, we did have people from all over the world participating in it. So that was kind of cool. I mean, what do you think? How do you make a conference engaging, or what do you find engaging in online events?
Was it the spice of life is a little bit of, for variability,
Okay.
having to do different things. How regular talks, having those panels are also good, and on interstitials, something to kind of like get your blood flowing, especially if you're like sitting there the entire time. Like doing something to get someone up and kind of like moving around a little bit can definitely be a help.
That's a good point. So maybe conferences should have like a stretch time, or we're going to do some exercises, or I don't know, you could put them to, I don't know, some sort of Stoic theme or something like that.
But like when you're at a physical conference, you're walking between halls to go and see the different talks that you want to go see, unless you don't have a single hall. And then though, you're getting your butt out of the seat, right? And so like there's a little bit of physical, and so if you can replicate that, just a little bit, it could definitely help. Because if there's a really long conference that's on it, once you get on to hour 4 of thinking about something, that starts to, get a little bit Charlie Brown, wah, wah, wah. Now, for those of you who are too young to remember that, because they don't play these shows that often anymore on TV, there used to be all these Charlie Brown specials. And the young kids, who are all the main characters in Charlie Brown, whenever an adult would talk, I think it might have like been a trombone or something, right? Exactly. Yeah. It was like wah 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 wah.
It's just unintelligible gibberish, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that happens at conferences. I had a good friend who is also a Benedictine monk, and he's about 20 years older than me, and he told me this about 10 years ago when we were at a conference at Notre Dame University. And he said, I'm going to go to these first 2 sessions and then I'll see you later. And I was like, you're not going to hang around for the rest? And he's like, after the first two sessions, I'm shot. My brain can't take any more stuff in. And so I just go out and check out the city, or, go back to my room or do something like that. And I was like, oh, well, that's too bad. And then I found myself, later on when I was going to conferences, realizing that maybe 3 or 4 talks, that's it for me. And maybe when I'm his age, it'll be down to 2 talks as well.
Got to pick and choose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So lessons, right? That's the topic that we're talking about. Lessons learned from putting on Stoicon and from the Stoicon itself, from what people had to say. Some of these are things that came out of the discussions or the presentations and the Q&A. And some of these are things that we just want to share with you that we learned by organizing and putting on the event. And you might say, well, hey, dummies, you should have known that ahead of time. But there's a lot of things we have to learn by experience. And so we thought it would be kind of cool to share these with you. And I'll lead off with the first one. And this ties in with something Dan has already said. You have to build in breaks. We thought that in order to make it a really high impact event and get as much in as we could, we would start it at like 9 o'clock Central Time, 10 o'clock Eastern, and finish up around 4 o'clock, and so it was event after event after event. It would be, a talk, and then a panel, and then a workshop. And we didn't really include breaks. And so we got really favorable feedback, almost uniformly positive. People really liked the speakers. They really liked the topics. They liked the format. But the number one complaint that we had was you should have put in a lunch break or put in a break somewhere, like bathroom breaks or, 10 minutes here and there. And, when I first heard that, I was like, but anybody can get up at any time that they want to. It's an online conference. You can, if you want to go off to the bathroom for 10 minutes, you can do that. Nobody's stopping you. It's not like being, chained to the laptop or anything like that. And the funny thing that we heard after that was nobody wanted to take themselves away from the screen. There was what we call FOMO, fear of missing out. And so people did put themselves, I'm not going to say like at great risk health-wise or something like that, but they made some sacrifices in terms of getting lunch or going to the bathroom or walking around or stuff like that because they were glued to the screen. And so in some ways, it wasn't too much of a good thing. But I guess the lesson here is you have to space out the good thing. You do have to like introduce some breaks and say, okay, now we're going to have some downtime. And there's probably a lot of ways to do that. I thought it might be, we might lose people if we programmed in that sort of thing. But I guess that's an important lesson. In a face-to-face conference, you really do have to build in time in between sessions for people to get from session to session. And generally there is some sort of lunch break, but everybody's there at the same time. When you're across time zones, lunch for us would be whatever people are having around 6, 7 o'clock in Great Britain or in Europe or wherever else they happen to be, right?
Right. And so with that saying, I think we should take a break right about now. 2, 1. Okay, and we're back. But yeah, I've also noticed this, like not only just for like general like getting up and talking about, but it's nice to have that little bit of time to reflect on what you just heard.
Yeah.
If you go directly into another talk, then you're like, it's things kind of start to blend a little bit. And I was having actually just the same exact problem this week when I was doing like a whole bunch of interviews. And I had 8 candidates lined up in 4 hours and back to back to back to back to back, and it was a marathon.
Yeah.
And I've now learned that I need to have a couple of minutes between those, otherwise I'm not going to be able to properly take in the information that I just took in from that interview.
Were these face-to-face or were these online?
Zoom. Yeah.
So what do you think? My suspicion would be that it's more fatiguing to do it in Zoom, those back-to-back interviews, than it would be like if people were walking into your hotel room and then you say, all right, we're done, get the hell out of here. What do you think?
Yeah, potentially, because there's always going to be that transition time. You'll at least have like 60 seconds, and I'm like basically clicking off of one and clicking on to another.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have that happen, when most of my clientele are not here in the Milwaukee area, and I do tutorials and philosophical counseling and consulting and stuff like that. And sometimes I'll make the mistake of lining up like 1 hour block client after another,
Mm-hmm.
And those are the days when I'm really wiped out at the end.
Yeah, I know that feeling well.
Yeah. I'll, if you don't mind a little digression here, used to be in the hiring for academic positions that you do the first round of interviews at the big annual conference. So for philosophy, it was the American Philosophical Association Eastern Conference, which was horrible because they'd schedule it between Christmas and New Year's. So if you were going for interviews, you could say, like, I'm going to have 0 time with my family. And they would put you into this giant ballroom, and there would be like tables everywhere, and you would get your first round of interviews. These are not the on-campus interviews. This is just like the first round where they would probably interview 16 people, 16 candidates for any given job, and then they would eliminate all but anywhere from 2 to 4 of them. And so people would go in, and they would be, you have to be here at 11:30, or you have to be here at 12:15, or whatever they arranged it as. And, everybody's sweating and wearing their fancy clothes that they brought along with them, and uncomfortable and nervous about what's going on. And you'd sit down at the table, and it's just like, there's so much noise in that room. It's hard to hear what the interviewers are actually asking you. And you got the amount of time that you have, and that's it. And if you're a candidate, well, that sucks, right? It's not a fun experience. But it's
a cattle call.
Yeah, but it's even worse if you're an interviewer, because you are there with you and your colleagues, and you've already got a job, right? But you had to miss your time with your family between Christmas and New Year's, and you're there in Philadelphia, New York, wherever it happens to be that time, eating hotel food and sleeping on an uncomfortable bed, and now you have to interview 16 people for that job. And you might not just be interviewing for one position, you might be interviewing for 3. So you might have 50 people to interview in those several days, very unenviable position. And after a while, I imagine your eyes just kind of glaze over, when people are giving you their carefully scripted answers to how are you going to contribute to our department, I imagine it's like that in corporate hiring too,
Yeah. So let's
come back to Stoicon.
Yeah. We're done with our break in this digression. Yeah. And we can go on to
and the next lesson is, I think, a really interesting one. And Dan got to see a lot more of that than I did because I was emceeing, so I was focused on trying to find questions in the chat. Dan, you got to see a lot more of what was going on.
Yeah, I was actively in that chat. It was fun. So yeah, it's once again, you have the conference and you have the speakers, and then you have the side conference, the side conversations, and especially when it's an online chat, it's not just little groups of people. It is everyone. That's definitely a brand new thing that online conferences have brought in.
Yeah. Because if it was a face-to-face conference, somebody could be doing a presentation and you lean over to the person next to you and you're like, I think this person's full of crap. Yeah. Maybe they don't know what they're talking about. Haven't they read this book? Right. But if you do it in Zoom and you write something like that, everybody can see it.
Right. And so, there was a couple of interesting conversations. There was one about the what can we call those fellow members of the cosmos that I guess we give a moral weight or consideration to? And so within Stoicism, usually the thing that defines someone that has moral consideration is, do they have this ability to reason? They might not use it, but they have the ability to do it.
Yeah.
And so, in the past, people have talked about, can we extend this to other higher level primates, to dolphins, to where are you cutting that line? But regardless of what it is, we now have this group of people or entities that have some sort of rational capacity, and so what do you call those people? As a group, and what is, if you're thinking about we're American or something, or we're Milwaukeeans or whatever, what do you call the largest group possible? And so someone came up with a beautiful Cosmo homies, and I thought that was great. And then I took that and I turned it into Cosmo kin.
Yeah,
because it just seems a little bit more workable.
Fellow residents of the cosmos. That's a cool idea. This is a bit of a side topic, but would you want to draw a line, in the animal world, between what we often call the higher animals and then, things like insects or oysters or, would you say it's important, if we're talking about treating them with some sort of dignity and respect, do we have to show that equally? You think about corvids, crows and ravens and stuff like that. They're amazingly smart, we're finding out. And then you look at the average paper wasp, not so smart.
Yeah.
So
I don't know, and I don't know where the line is. The line is fuzzy.
Okay.
And I haven't seen anyone present a really good case of how to make a test for that.
Yeah.
To define that line. I guess I would consider a lot of the great apes to be on one side of that line. I would consider a lot of cephalopods, so octopi.
Yep.
To be on that right side of the line. But I don't know about corvids. Corvids are very smart. And what are they, like? I think some of them have like the intelligence of like what, a 2-year-old or something?
Yeah, which is pretty good,
That's pretty good.
I mean, and they seem to have something like culture, because if you mess with a crow, you will be on that crow's you-know-what list.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that crow has died, you'll still be on other crows' lists. So somehow they've communicated what you look like, how you should be treated. There's something going on there, do we want to call that rationality? I don't know. It really depends on how we define it. But that's a cool side topic that we didn't really talk about. Kai Whiting and
but that was last year.
Leonidas, they presented some stuff on that in their presentation, but it wasn't. It was only about like extending things to the environment, right? It wasn't.
Right.
It wasn't about like where do we draw the lines. What else?
Right.
What else did people talk about in side conversations?
So there's a big ongoing conversation, which is kind of like there is this distinction within Stoicism. We have modern Stoicism and we have like traditional Stoicism. And traditional Stoicism has this very, strong theological foundation, whereas a lot of modern Stoicism says you can kind of lay that on a number of different foundations, theological or not. But there are some people within the more traditional Stoicism that were asserting basically that you really can't have Stoicism without any sort of God concept. And so I guess if you want to throw avatars into this, we've got maybe Kai on one side and like Massimo on the other. Yeah.
So Kai Whiting and Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo Pigliucci, very famously, is an atheist who did a lot of stuff with the skeptic community, more or less about 10 years ago, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that not only do you not have to buy into traditional notions of like a Stoic God, who's not like the Judeo-Christian God. It's a very different conception, but it's still a God conception. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to buy into the notion of a providentially ordered universe. Massimo seems to think that you don't have any good reason to think that that's the case, and so it's reasonable to not believe that sort of stuff, right? So there'd be like a modern Stoicism should be more or less atheistic, or at least agnostic, right?
Right. Like if you're theistic, great, you can stick that in there.
Yeah.
If not, he has a book in which he outlines exactly that argument. But I
think it's that How to Be a Stoic book, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're right. Thank you. And then I guess Kai recently, within the last year or two, has put out a paper in which he kind of asserts that you can't have, I believe the gist is, and I hope I'm still manning him well enough, that to have virtue be the sole good, one must have a providential God.
Yeah.
And so if you accept that, then you must also then accept some sort of providential God.
That's a strong claim, Mm-hmm. But yeah, so there was talk about the conversation that was going on. I got to see a little bit of it, and it seemed like it was certainly energetic, but it didn't see. I didn't see anybody acting like a jerk to anybody else. Did you?
No. There might have been a couple of like assertions.
Okay.
But there was definitely no like ad hominem. No one actually attacking someone's like individual personhood or anything. But there was definitely some incredulity going on with someone's like, what do you mean? Like,
yeah.
And so I don't know. I don't know if it was the pure ideal of interlocutors, a la like a Platonic dialogue.
Yeah. Well, even in Platonic dialogues, people get pretty I won't say mean, but they get heated and they say stuff that maybe they would, rethink later on. Interestingly, there's a dialogue where Socrates, who is acting like a jerk at this dialogue, gets told by the host, this is the Gorgias, he gets told by the host that he shouldn't get angry because he's taking Socrates as if he's losing his temper. That's why Socrates is saying the things that he is. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on there, but certainly if Socrates can be warned not to go too far,
then anyone can.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it was lively. There were like links to papers and whatnot, and it's only so useful to be in the middle of a conversation, and it's like, oh, here's a 10-page paper, philosophical paper. Go read that real quick.
Yeah. Should there be limits on side conversations? Like maybe nobody should post, substantive papers that require you to like stop listening to the actual speaker and attend to them.
I wouldn't put any.
Okay.
Like, I think like it wasn't super useful because I there's no way that you could continue that conversation with that. It's like you got to read. Here's some homework to do.
Yeah,
that's like come back next week and we can talk about that. But I also was happy to have it in the conversation because it's like, oh, here is something that's a deeper dive, and if I wanted to, I'm happy to go and read into that.
If it was like an actual physical conference, you could say to the person, hey, let's you and me go outside. We're not going to beat each other up. We're going to actually talk about this, and we'll leave that speaker behind. We don't, in an online conversation, we don't really have that option. But maybe it'd be cool if there were ways, not to go into like breakout rooms, but like to follow up on the conversation later on. Maybe that's something that we need to figure out how we would create options for. What do you think?
Yeah. Like there are breakout rooms, but I don't know.
Those have to be done by the people who are running it, though.
Exactly. And so it would require some ability to like connect with that person and then make your own little breakout room.
Yeah.
Which at least for using the Zoom platform like we were, was not a viable option.
Yeah. And if you were just to like say, hey, let's go over here in this Google chat or something, here's the link for it. Anybody could jump on that unless you're like privately messaging the person.
Right.
So that might not be a good solution either. I don't really have a solution myself, but I think it's something worth talking about and thinking about.
So this quick diatribe. This reminds me of my experiences in VR chat.
It's good that,
VR
good
chat
that you
is,
warned us it's going to be a rant.
In VR chat, there's the ability to you create new rooms and you make little portals, and anyone that you want can follow you through the portal. And so I kind of love this idea of like virtually actually going outside, and you could end up in like Edo period Japan. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah, neat.
And so or you're in space or whatever you want because it's VR and you can create whatever you want. But I love this idea of like being at maybe a Stoic conference in a couple of years, and we're all in VR doing that. We're all sitting around in a conference, and then it's like, hey, I want to talk to you about this thing over here, and you open up a portal, and you just go to another plane of existence.
Actually, I think that's a really cool idea that we could have a VR Stoicon. I don't know anything anywhere near the tech that would be required to make it happen, but wouldn't it be cool instead of just like seeing the head of a person on a Zoom thing to more or less feel like you're there?
Right.
I'd love that.
Yeah, it's the wish of like Second Life. That's what they tried to do, but it was all through your computer screen, and it was a really poor simulacrum.
Yeah. So maybe now we could actually pull it off.
Yeah. Although it's going to
restrict
the amount of people that could be direct participants.
That's true.
Just because the technology is still rather new.
Yeah, so accessibility we would lose some of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe we do two different kinds of things. Although then some people be like, well, we're the second-class citizens, so they might not like that.
At the very least, you could capture the conference with a in VR camera and display that through YouTube or whatever.
Yeah, that would be cool.
You could stream the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. But let's get to some more lessons.
Yeah.
So let's. Terminology is always an issue.
Why is that?
Because people come up, at least with the very, those people who are very new to Stoicism, you're coming in with a colloquial understanding of the word Stoic for the very first part. And so this is kind of like one of our first things that we try to knock down is the difference between little s Stoicism and big S Stoicism. Whereas little s is kind of, your stiff upper lip, your repressing your emotions type of idea for Stoicism. Yeah. Whereas Stoicism, capital S, is the philosophy as a way of life, and has some ideas that are like absolutely the opposite of what you would think with little s Stoicism.
Even in ancient times, the Stoics got criticized for introducing a lot of new terminology or taking words that were already there, like virtue, and then like giving them a twist that was different than how other people were using the term. So this can be an obstacle, I think, for newcomers. And maybe the lesson is it's really important that we tell our presenters or panelists, hey, listen, there's going to be a lot of newcomers. If you use a term like the indifference, right, or a preferred indifferent, you got to say what that actually means, or you're going to lose people. What are some other ones that you would say, like, these are really high potential for losing part of the audience terms? Anything else that comes to mind?
A lot of times, this is what we're going to get into a little bit more, but just when we talk about the dichotomy of control,
you got to really
very well define that. When good and bad are
true.
Are also tricky within Stoicism.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anything else that come to your mind immediately?
I was thinking actually about when people use Greek or Latin terminology when they don't actually need to. It sounds really cool to say premeditatio malorum, but if somebody's coming in for the first time, if they haven't studied any Stoicism, they just heard about Stoicon and they're like, yeah, I can do this on a Saturday afternoon, and they hear you throwing out this Latin or Greek lingo and they don't know what it means. I mean, I'm not saying you can't use terms like that, but they have to be explained. They have to be characterized. Because another way of talking about that is negative visualization, or more literally, thinking about bad things before they happen. So I don't know if anything is gained by talking about arete instead of virtue, or eudaimonia instead of happiness. Unless you explain what the term actually signifies.
I tend to like to use both the Greek and an English translation, so that if they
side by side, you mean, or
yeah, okay. So eudaimonia or happiness, and or what is it? Flourishing, human flourishing.
Yeah.
Or all just because none of our idea of happiness doesn't actually encompass what when you're talking about eudaimonia. At least in the general sense. And so you have to
happiness is just a psychological state that could, be fleeting and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And which is quite different. What is Stoic happiness in this regard?
Right.
What is that well-being of a human, being excellent as a human and the feeling of being excellent as a human. They're kind of deep topics, and yeah, I absolutely agree. Without proper discussion, you're just going to talk over people.
That's right. Yeah. Another lesson, I'm going to jump down a little bit. We actually compiled a long list, and I don't think we're going to get to all of them. This was one that was actually sent to me in an email shortly after the conference. And it was from somebody who self-identifies as a hardcore Stoic and who has a pretty significant place within, let's call it the Stoic community. And he wrote me and he said, one of the things that I learned from the discussions going on in the panel was Stoicism isn't necessarily for every situation. I thought that Stoicism was, because it's a philosophy is a way of life, so it should be good for everything, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. I don't think it diminishes Stoicism to say that you don't need to always bring up Stoicism. I think in some ways it actually makes it more effective if you can tell the difference between when classic Stoic philosophy is going to help you and when it's actually going to be potentially a hindrance or at least just not particularly helpful.
Right. So examples of this, definitely like a direct example is a lot of the things that Stoicism gets to is to a more calm mind, to get, like a lot of these psychological benefits therein. But that's not going to really help you if you're like got a chemical imbalance or you're like bipolar or something. There's something there. You can't just think your way out of that like situation.
Yeah, and no matter how many like Stoic quotes you post on your refrigerator or make affirmations, you still got an issue that you have to deal with, perhaps with medication or psychotherapy or something like that. I mean, Stoicism can be useful in telling you have a choice about how you look at the situation, but you don't choose to not. You can choose to not have that problem, but that choice is going to be totally ineffective. So. Stoicism also requires modifying habits. It's not like you can have a bad habit of, a bad temper or something, then snap your fingers and suddenly you're calm all the time or anything like that. And I think a lot of people interpret Stoicism, and it's not just Stoicism. People do this with yoga. People do this with mindfulness meditation. They want to treat it as if it's the one-size-fits-all solution for everything.
Mm-hmm. And it's a panacea.
Exactly. Yeah, something that heals everything, right? And it's just that's just not the case. It's really helpful. And I want to see what you think about this idea. I want to say that philosophies as ways of life that are well structured, that have been thought out for a long time, that have practices and modes of development and stuff like that, they are more effective when we use them, say, 90% of the time rather than 100% of the time. What do you think about that idea?
So it kind of reminds me of overfitting. So
what is
in
that?
Machine learning, there's a concept of overfitting.
Okay.
So you'll take a data set and you're going to train this machine learning model on. And if you get the model to return like a correct answer 99.5% of the time with your training data, then there's a very high likely chance that when you actually throw in new novel general data to the model is going to perform poorly because it is overfit to the small subset of data that you've already given it. And so there's definitely you don't want it to overfit too much. And so the idea here would be we're trying to shove everything into the Stoic box in every situation when the Stoic box might not be the optimum solution for that particular issue.
That's a really interesting analogy. When you were talking about that, I was thinking about the person who goes to the gym and they have certain exercises that they like doing, And they only do those exercises, right? And so they get really, really good at benching, but they don't do other things that they ought to be doing to strengthen their body. And then they try to do something like help somebody move, right? And when you're helping somebody move, nothing fits the way it's supposed to. You don't have ideal situations like laying flat perfectly, with the bar at a 90-degree angle or anything like that. Everything's screwed up. And you could be really strong and be able to do great things with the leg press and the bench and all these sorts of things, and yet throw your back out or whatever else you're going to do helping somebody move, because you've made your body really good at certain things, but the world isn't quite like that.
Yeah, maybe a more mundane analogy is, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah. Yeah, and Stoicism, so this is actually a great segue into talking about something else that came up a lot in the panels, which is Stoicism shouldn't be reduced down to, like you're saying, down to just one tool, one hammer. The one that people do that with the most is one you've already mentioned, the dichotomy of control, which is making the distinction between things that are in our control, which we should be occupied with and care about, and things that are outside of our control, which we should recognize as being outside of our control. And yes, that's a really important Stoic idea, although as people pointed out, I think it was actually Massimo Pigliucci who pointed this out, or John Sellers, that is an idea that only gets formulated very late in Stoicism with Epictetus. So clearly the earlier Stoics didn't think it was quite so important as that. They thought other ideas were at least equally or perhaps more important. And I think, if we use the exercise program thing again, are you better off like having 3 or 4 exercises that you do all the time and you get really good at? Or should you be cross-training? Should you be learning how to use your body in all sorts of different ways? Well, Stoicism is doing that in terms of your mind, your capacity for choosing and prioritizing, and your emotions and your habits and all these other things. And so we probably need to have a lot of different exercises and a lot of different concepts. And the ancient Stoics did, Seneca, when he's asked by somebody to give quotes, he's like, I can't give you any quotes because it's all good. It's all, you're like asking me to find in a field, the things that are standing out. They're all, tip top. So,
although he does relent eventually.
Yeah, he says, "All right, dummy, I'll give you some quotes for you." But I think there's something. I really think there's something to this. It doesn't. I think some people could get discouraged. They'd be like, "Oh man, I just started learning this, and now somebody's telling me I got to learn like 10 times more." That could be demoralizing if you choose to let it be demoralizing, or you could be like, "Oh man, this is great. I like this concept here. I can't wait till I learn all the other concepts and they all fit together like a cool network or something like that."
Well, it looks like you just used the concept of reframing. But yeah, like this is one of the big things that like Stoicism talks sometimes about, like some main practices being like 3 legs of a tripod, that they are held up by each other, and that no individual one of these things is going to be like your be-all end-all. This is the difference between, seeing Stoicism as like a life hack versus a philosophy for life. That the philosophy of life is the whole group working in concert together, whereas if you're going to go and just take like that dichotomy of control, which is like, it's been touted about, especially with modern Stoicism, as one of the main things that like people talk about early on. Can be incredibly useful, but it also results in this issue that I've called the Stoic trap. And I've given
what's that?
So I gave a presentation on this to the Stoicon Brazil last year. And so the Stoic trap is this idea of kind of the apathy that arises from one who takes on the dichotomy of control to much. And so they go like, well, that thing's not in my control. And so I'm not going to care about it at all. And then I become apathetic. I'm not going to do anything in the world to make anything better. And I feel like I have no obligation to anyone else. But the problem here is that Stoicism, all of the ancient Stoics talk about, working in harmony with all of your other, fellow man, that we are, working together like, 2 feet, 2 hands, 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower, to, quote Marcus Aurelius. And if you're using the dichotomy of control to remove yourself from the community of other rational beings, then you're not practicing Stoicism. And so what the point here is that the dichotomy of control allows you to focus on things that are the most important, and these include your community and your fellow man, and to know the things that you can do to make that a better place for all these people, not to say, oh, it's off my shoulders, I can't touch it anymore, I can't do anything that's not in my entire control. But what is in your entire control, especially at this point in time in the world where, we live in more of a democracy than you got in Rome, with the caste system there, that we actually have some, we have greater influence. That doesn't mean that we can control things entirely, but we can do actions that do have influence in the world.
It's very interesting because you're in effect saying that something that gets looked at as perhaps the quintessential Stoic practice can be non-Stoic when it's done wrong.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or if you use it by itself.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. We're getting close to the end, so I think we can maybe fit in one more before we have to wrap it up. And so if I had to pick one other lesson, it would be, if you build it, they will come. But you have to build it right, and you have to promote it right, especially if it's an online conference. So, we were really fortunate in that we had about as many people this time around as we did last year. It was a great success. People really liked it. But there are some things that we need to do different, like building in breaks, maybe having even more variety in the formats. We did a workshop and lightning talks and panels and a lot of talks and a keynote address. Maybe we need to do some other things. But I mean, the cool thing is, if you do put together something and you get the word out there, people are hungry for this sort of intellectual and practical engagement. What do you think? Is there anything else to say about that, or should we jump right into our final quote?
We've got a moment here. I guess, once again, like what Greg and Andy did, that they're great planning to make sure that all the speakers were there, to figure out how to run the moderation in the comments, to build out the breakout rooms. There was lots of emails back and forth with all of the presenters and the sub-helpers. Yeah. To make sure that these things, and so just making sure that everyone's on the same page is something that Greg and Andy did quite well. So,
thanks
for all you aspiring runners of conferences.
Well, I think we have to end on our final thoughts.
In respect to running conferences, we leave you with the words of Massimo Pigliucci, one of the first lessons from Stoicism, then, is to focus our attention and efforts where we have most power, and then let the universe run as it will. This will save us both a lot of energy and a lot of worry.